Whether you were talking about boosting nature positive production, whether you're talking about access to safe and nutritious foods or resilience to shocks, we need women's voices and leadership in food systems.
Today, it's my pleasure to have you meet Dr. Jemimah Njuki, who is IFPRI's Africa Director. And she's doing some very important work to place gender issues, women's empowerment front and center at the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit. Jemimah, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Charlotte.
So the UN Food Systems Summit, which is the first of its kind, actually, is really a great opportunity to focus on women and to think about the vital role that they play in food systems and to talk about the many constraints that they still face. Could you tell us what concretely you're hoping to see emerging out of the summit?
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And as you say, it is such a great opportunity to put gender equality and women's empowerment at the center of food systems transformation. Very often, we get to integrate gender after the fact, and I'm really excited that the Special Envoy in developing the structures of the UN Food Systems Summit, that gender became integrated from the start as a lever that cuts across everything else that's happening in the lead up to the summit. So we know women play critical roles in food systems. That is in no doubt, either as producers, as processors, as traders, and as consumers, making important household decisions on food consumption. Globally, about 43% of labor in agriculture is contributed by women. But despite these really critical roles that they play, we know there are serious and fundamental inequalities within the food system. We know there are differences in access to resources between men and women, between households that are managed by men and those that are managed by women. For example, just in terms of things like financial inclusion, we know of the 2 billion people globally that are unbanked, around 1.1 billion of those are actually women. In sub-Saharan Africa, to just give you a concrete example, only 35% of women have a bank account compared to 45% of men. We know, given these critical roles, that women are still underrepresented in leadership positions, whether we are talking about in government, in producer organizations, in consumer organizations, in global, national, and local food companies that are working in food systems. And so these are all critical things that we are looking at as part of the gender lever of the UN food systems. And what I actually want to see come out of this is that gender equality and women's empowerment become a central element and a key driver to be considered, like any other drivers, whether it's climate change, as important in driving the transformation of food systems. The second thing that I really want to see come out of this summit is women's leadership and women's voices being heard, because very often we are missing women's voices in international processes.
Given the need to really place women's equality and women's empowerment front and center at the Systems Summit, it seems to me there's a lot of great opportunities for you to be doing that. Can you explain maybe first, what is the gender change lever which you're managing?
So as you know, Charlotte, the UN Food Systems Summit is organized across 5 action tracks. One is on ensuring access to safe and nutritious foods. One is on shifting to sustainable consumption patterns. The third one is on boosting nature positive production. The fourth one on equitable livelihoods, and the fifth one on resilience to shocks and vulnerabilities. Now, across these 5 action tracks are 4 change levers, one on finance, one on innovation, one on human rights, and one on gender. And the objective of the gender change lever is threefold. The first one is to make sure that the game-changing solutions that are coming out of the action tracks actually embed gender in them, gender equality and women's empowerment. That as the action tracks are developing these game-changing solutions, they're using a gender lens. They're thinking about what the impact of those game-changing solutions is going to be on women and girls and boys and men and other groups. The second objective of the change lever is to look across at the food system and say, what are the major causes of gender inequalities in the food system? What are the priority actions that stakeholders can take to address these gender inequalities? So we are also looking at what we are calling cross-cutting gender game-changing solutions that apply across the food system, that if implemented, if applied, could actually lead to equality and women's empowerment in the food system. The third objective of the change lever is to ensure women's voices, the voices of those working on gender and food systems, the voices of other marginalized groups, including indigenous women, women in the informal sector in food systems, women agricultural wage laborers, that all these voices are represented in the processes in the lead up and during and after the Food Systems Summit.
That's a terrific architecture, and I'm glad you're driving that gender lever. Now, in addition to the important analytical work that you're doing, and you're also a food systems champion, you're leading some of the dialogues around gender. And I think you had a first one within Africa, first regional dialogue. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what comes next in the dialogue series?
So in order to achieve our third objective of making sure that women's voices, the voices of different groups, of women's rights organizations, civil society organizations, researchers working on gender and food systems, to make sure that those voices are actually heard, we are organizing regional gender and food systems dialogues. Now, these dialogues are bringing together government, they're bringing together researchers, civil society, farmers organizations, you name it, young men, young women, youth-based organizations, to actually have a conversation on what they think are some of the game-changing solutions? What do they think are some of the priorities that if we implement, we're going to achieve gender equality in food systems? So we had a first dialogue for Africa on February 9. A lot of the outcomes from that dialogue are already being used by action track leaders to actually make sure that what is being proposed is coming out in the lists and in their priorities for game-changing solutions. And we've also taken some of that as the change lever to see what are some of the ones that don't fit neatly into action tracks and which ones of them can we actually develop as cross-cutting solutions. I'll give you an example. Whether you were talking about boosting nature-positive production, whether you're talking about access to safe and nutritious foods or resilience to shocks, we need women's voices and leadership in food systems. So that's one of the things that cut across all the action tracks. So rather than have it developed 5 times, we actually then are proposing that can we think about a game-changing solution that focuses on building, enhancing, promoting, including women's voices and leadership in food systems. And whether that's at government level, whether that's at private sector level, whether that's at farmer organization level. So those dialogues are really critical in getting us to hear people's voices in terms of bringing their experiences to the table in terms of what's going to work, what needs to be scaled.
So I'm wondering now, when you think about the action plan that will emerge from this summit, how do you see gender fitting into that? All too often, unfortunately, gender seems to be a little bit of an afterthought or the last of many items that need to be considered. Do you think that this summit gives us an opportunity to really ensure that gender can be more mainstreamed across these kinds of deliberations at the international level?
Definitely. And I think that's one of our most critical roles in this process, that people do not develop these game-changing solutions, do not develop commitments, and then after the fact, we try and come and retrofit gender and women's empowerment to it, because we know that doesn't work. We end up with commitments that end with, we will do this and we will target especially women, which in a lot of cases then doesn't end up in being concrete actions, targeted, well thought out actions. The other thing we are talking about is policy. How do you have gender transformative national food systems policy? Because we need gender equality anchored in the legal frameworks in countries as well. We need it anchored in policies, because if you anchor that in policy, then it flows down to implementation, it flows down to investments and how budgets are allocated, and it flows all the way to monitoring and evaluation and accountability. Right?
Yeah, thank you for raising that critical aspect of policy, and it's certainly one that's near and dear to IFPRI's heart, because we know that really integrating the gender and women's empowerment issues, it's not just for the sake of women, although that's important enough considering we're half of the global population, but it also has been shown to lead to better functioning food systems for everybody. So thank you so much.
Thank you to Charlotte. I think my aim is to make sure that we are not just talking about sustainable and healthy food systems, but that we are also talking about just and equitable food systems by making sure that they work for all and that they do not leave anyone behind.